I can still see it as if it happened this morning. The way the wind caught the flag just as the band began to play, and my boy's eyes, wide and unblinking, followed every ripple of red, white, and blue. He was 4, maybe 5. Small enough that his hand still fit inside mine like it belonged there, large enough to start asking the kind of questions that live in a man's chest long after he's gone. It was Veterans Day. Our little Midwestern town wasn't much to brag about: 2 traffic lights, a diner that burned the eggs half the time, and a single hardware store that also sold fishing bait. But every November, the main street transformed into something different. Flags on every lamppost, paper poppies pinned to coats, and the distant thump of drums that seemed to echo against the very bricks. We stood at the curb in the cold, him in that patched denim jacket my late wife had sewn for him. The sleeves were too long, swallowing his wrists, but he refused to roll them up, said they made him feel grown. The crowd pressed closer as the first rank of soldiers marched into view. Boots hit pavement in perfect rhythm. The air changed, became heavier somehow. My boy's little body went still, like the world had hit pause. The brass section of the high school band blared a tune they'd probably practiced for months, but my boy wasn't listening to the music. His eyes were locked on the soldiers. They were tall, polished, unshakable. To a boy his age, they must have looked like giants. "Daddy," he whispered without looking up, "were you one of them?" I tightened my grip on his hand. "Yes," I said, "a long time ago." He didn't ask for details, not yet. Instead, he watched them until the last soldier disappeared around the corner. Then, as the clapping faded, he looked up at me with that face children get when they've just made a decision no one else can change. "I'm gonna be like you." That night, after the parade, we sat at the kitchen table. It was the same table I'd bought with his mother at a yard sale the year we married. One leg wobbled if you leaned on it wrong. We'd eaten every meal there, laughed there, argued there. Tonight it was covered with something I hadn't touched in years: my old uniform. I laid it out carefully. The fabric smelled faintly of mothballs, but underneath I could still catch the desert dust, the sweat, and something else. Something I couldn't name. My boy reached out, running his fingers over the name patch. "Our name." "This was yours?" he asked. "Yes." His gaze shifted to the ribbons and pins. "How do you get these?" I smiled faintly. "You earn them." He didn't understand yet. Not the aching feet, the 4 a.m. wake-ups, the cold chow, the homesickness that creeps in when you're half a world away. He didn't know about the quiet fear that never leaves you even when you're home. All he saw was pride stitched into fabric. Over the years, his questions grew sharper. "What's basic training like? Did you ever get hurt? Did you save anybody?" I answered what I could. Some things I held back, not because I wanted to hide the truth, but because I believed a boy should be allowed to keep his dreams intact as long as possible. The world would chip away at them soon enough. When he turned 18, he signed the papers without hesitation. I should have been ready for it. I'd seen it in him since that Veterans Day. But still, my chest tightened when I watched him walk into the recruiter's office. He looked over his shoulder and gave me a grin like a kid heading into an amusement park. I smiled back, but my stomach felt like it was holding a bag of wet sand. "There's something you should know about service. It doesn't just take you, it takes everyone who loves you." The nights his mother and I spent waiting for letters, the mornings when the phone didn't ring, the Christmases with one less chair at the table, it all came back when he shipped out. The first time he wrote me from boot camp, the handwriting was different, sharper, straighter, like the drills had gotten into his pen as much as his posture. He said it was tough, but he was tougher. He told me he'd been picked for leadership training. I read that line 3 times and I swear my hands shook a little. I kept every letter in an old shoebox under my bed. Not because I'm sentimental, at least, that's what I tell myself, but because those words were proof that the boy I raised was still out there, still finding his way. The years passed, and with each visit home, I saw more of the soldier in him and less of the boy. His shoulders squared, his eyes learned to scan a room without moving his head. There was a steadiness to him I recognized immediately. It was the same look I'd seen in my own mirror decades ago. But something else changed too. Our conversations shifted. Where once he'd asked about me, now he spoke more about his unit, his commanding officers, his next goal. I didn't mind. Pride has a way of filling in the empty spaces where words used to be. Still, sometimes, just sometimes, I missed the boy who'd once gripped my hand at a parade and said he wanted to be like me. I didn't know then what the years ahead would hold. I didn't know there'd come a day when he'd stand at the center of a room filled with applause and cameras, dressed in a uniform far newer and cleaner than mine, and that I wouldn't be there to see it. But that's not today's story. Today is about beginnings, about the spark that catches before the fire, about a boy seeing his future in the shine of another man's boots. And maybe that's why I'm telling it to you. Because somewhere, someone listening has a dream for their child, or a child with a dream they can't quite name. And sometimes all it takes is a single moment, one parade, one look, one sentence, to change the whole course of a life. So if you've carried someone's dream inside your chest, if you've ever stood on the sidelines and felt that swell of pride you can't put into words, give this story a little like. Stick around, maybe even subscribe. This one's just getting started, and trust me, you'll want to see how it ends. The first time I saw him in uniform, it didn't feel real. He stood at the end of the hallway in the base visitors area, his cap tucked under one arm, the sharp creases in his trousers so crisp they could have cut glass. For a second, I forgot to breathe. That was my boy, the same kid who used to spill chocolate milk on his shirt and cry when I scraped the gravel out of his knees, standing there like a man who had never stumbled. When he saw me, he smiled, but it was different from before. There was still warmth in it, but it carried something else now, discipline, a kind of composure that said I belonged to something bigger than myself. I pulled him into a hug, and the fabric of his jacket felt stiff against my hands. It was the kind of stiffness that doesn't fade, the kind that's earned. "You look good, son," I told him. "So do you, Dad," he said, though we both knew my hair was grayer than last time, and my shoulders weren't quite as straight. We spent that afternoon together in the small town outside the base. Ate burgers at a diner that probably hadn't changed its menu since the '70s. I tried not to stare too much, but I couldn't help noticing the way people looked at him when he walked by, like they knew they were in the presence of someone who carried a little more weight on his back than the rest of us. Over lunch, he told me about training, how the first weeks were hell, how his drill sergeant had a voice that could rattle the windows, how he thought about quitting every night but couldn't bring himself to do it. "You never told me that," I said. "I didn't want you to think I was weak." I laughed. "Son, admitting you're struggling isn't weakness. Quitting because you're scared, that's different, but you didn't quit." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The months turned into years, and each time he came home, there was less of the boy I once knew. He was sharper, quicker to act, slower to speak. He had stories, but they were measured, stripped of the kind of detail that might worry me, and I didn't push. I remembered what it was like to come home from service. Some things just stay locked in your chest because letting them out would mean reliving them. But little by little, I noticed something I couldn't ignore. When we walked through town together, he'd nod politely to old friends, but keep moving. He stopped coming with me to the veterans' breakfasts at the community hall. When I asked why, he'd say, "Those guys have their own stories, Dad. I'm focused on mine." It didn't sound wrong exactly, but it felt different. One summer, he invited me to the base family day. It was a big deal, families touring the facilities, meeting commanders, seeing demonstrations. I drove 4 hours to get there. When I arrived, he greeted me at the gate, all smiles. But once we stepped into the crowd, I saw him scanning the room, introducing me to a few people quickly before moving on. At one point, I overheard someone ask who I was. "That's my dad," he said without looking back. He served too. Pride swelled in me until the man asked, "Really? What rank?" And my son hesitated just a moment before saying, "Sergeant." The way he said it, flat, almost dismissive, stung more than I wanted to admit. I told myself not to read into it. He was building his career. He was surrounded by officers with degrees, medals, and spotless records. Maybe he was just adapting to the world he lived in now. But still, it planted a seed. one I didn't want to water. The last time we spoke before his deployment overseas, it was on my front porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and gold. He sat on the top step, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Dad," he said, "I'm going to be gone a while." I nodded. I figured. "It's going to be intense, not sure how often I can write." "Don't worry about that, just stay safe." He glanced at me like there was something more he wanted to say, but instead he stood, hugged me quickly, and walked to his car. The taillights disappeared down the road, and I stayed there on the porch until the street was quiet again. While he was gone, I kept busy, helped the neighbor fix his roof, volunteered at the local VFW, took long walks in the park when the weather allowed. But no matter what I did, the days moved slowly. I checked the mailbox twice a day, even when I knew there wouldn't be a letter. And when a letter finally came, it was short. "Doing well, busy. Command is strong, thinking of you, stay healthy." I read it 3 times and tried not to notice how little of him was in it. The day he returned, there was no parade, no grand reunion, just a phone call telling me he was back stateside and settling in. We met for lunch and he seemed fine, healthy, focused, but there was a distance I couldn't quite reach across. "Things are different out there, Dad," he said at one point. "I know," I told him, and I did know, but I also knew something else. Different didn't always mean better. Over the next year, his promotions came quicker. His name started appearing in base newsletters, and I'd hear from mutual friends that he was on the fast track. I was proud. How could I not be? But with each step up the ladder, I felt him stepping away from me in some invisible way. Sometimes I wondered if the boy from the parade was still in there somewhere, or if the man he'd become had quietly locked that boy away. I didn't know then that the distance I felt wasn't just in my head. That one day, when the biggest day of his career arrived, I wouldn't even get the call. If you've ever watched someone you love grow into a world you can't quite follow, maybe you know what I mean. Pride and distance can live side by side in a father's heart. And sometimes, you don't realize which one is winning until it's too late. The first letter came 3 weeks after he shipped out. I'd been checking the mailbox every day, pretending I wasn't disappointed when all I found were bills and grocery store flyers. Then one afternoon, there it was, a tan envelope with his handwriting scrawled across the front. The ink was darker than I remembered, the strokes more deliberate, as if he'd written each word with care. Inside, the paper smelled faintly of diesel and dust, though maybe that was just my imagination filling in the gaps. "Hey Dad, I'm settling in okay. The guys are solid. My CO says I've got potential, but there's a lot to learn. It's hot here, feels like you're walking around in someone else's breath. The food's not bad, though you'd laugh at how much we argue about powdered eggs. Anyway, I'll write again soon. Stay safe." I must have read it 6 times that night, my eyes catching on the smallest details. Potential. A lot to learn. It wasn't much, but it told me more than the words on the page. He was adjusting, finding his place, and he'd thought of me enough to write. I wrote back the same evening. "Son, you're stronger than you think. Don't forget that, and when the days feel long, remember they end. Always, I'm proud of you. Love, Dad." The letters kept coming, though not as often as I'd have liked. They were snapshots of his life in uniform, training exercises in the sun, long nights on watch, the occasional weekend in town. He wrote about the guys in his unit like they were brothers. I recognized the names after a while: Patterson, who could fix anything with duct tape; Ortiz, who always volunteered for extra duty; Mills, who made coffee so strong you could stand a spoon in it. In between the lines, I could feel his pride building. Every new skill, every commendation, every nod from his superiors, it all seemed to push him further along a path he'd chosen years ago, standing beside me at that Veterans Day parade. His letters brought me back to my own. I still have the ones I sent to his mother when I was deployed. They're tucked away in a shoebox in the back of my closet, yellowed and soft at the edges. Reading his words felt like holding a mirror to my younger self. The same eagerness, the same need to prove something, not just to the people in charge, but to the people waiting back home. But there was a difference. In my letters, I always came back to home, the The smell of her cooking, the way the porch light glowed at night, the sound of rain on the roof. In his, home was barely a passing thought. His world was out there now, not here. One night, after reading his latest letter, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my armchair with a mug of coffee, staring at the uniform hanging in my closet. The metals on the chest were dull now, the fabric softened by years of storage. I remembered the day I'd earned each one. Some came with a handshake and applause. Others, well, they came at a cost I never wrote about. There's one memory that sticks, no matter how many years pass. It was my second year overseas, and we'd been stationed near a small village. Supplies were scarce, tempers were high. One afternoon, a patrol went sideways. I won't get into the details. They're not the kind you share with your son. But I remember the heat of the sun on my neck, the ringing in my ears, and the way time seemed to stretch like taffy. When it was over, two of my friends didn't make it back. I carried one of them half a mile to the med tent, knowing it wouldn't matter. I never wrote about that in my letters home. His mother didn't need to carry that weight. And now, reading his words, I wondered what he was choosing not to tell me. The last letter before his first big deployment overseas was longer than usual. Dad, things are moving fast. I've been recommended for a leadership role. It's a lot of responsibility, and I won't lie, it's intimidating. But I think I can handle it. I remember you telling me that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but the one people trust when things get hard. I keep that in mind. I hope I'm making you proud. I folded the paper and held it in my hands for a long time. Pride and worry have a way of mixing until you can't tell them apart. I wanted to tell him that being a leader meant more than orders and strategy. It meant carrying the weight of other people's mistakes, their fears, their futures. But I didn't. Instead, I wrote back, "Son, pride isn't a trophy you win, it's a path you walk. Keep walking. I'm always with you." Months passed with only a few short notes. The world has a way of swallowing time when you're apart. Then one day, a letter arrived that felt different. "Dad, we had a situation the other night. Everyone's okay." I can't say more, but I kept my head. "My CO said I did well. I think you would have too." I sat at the kitchen table with that letter in front of me, my coffee going cold. I thought about the things he'd left unsaid, the gaps I could only fill with my own memories. I wanted to ask questions, to know exactly what happened. But I also knew that sometimes, not knowing is the only way to keep breathing easy. Still, I kept every letter. They piled up in the shoebox under my bed, a quiet testament to the distance between us. His words were steady, measured, often careful. Mine, in return, were filled with reminders to take care of himself, to remember who he was before the rank, before the medals. Because one day I feared he might forget. And if he did, I wanted my words to be there to bring him back. I didn't know that the letters would eventually stop altogether, not because he'd forgotten me, but because the man he was becoming no longer saw the need to write. I didn't know that one day, when the most important letter of all should have been an invitation, my mailbox would be empty. If you've ever waited for a letter that didn't come, you know the ache. It's not just about the words, it's about the space they should have filled. And sometimes, that silence says more than any sentence ever could. The first time he canceled, I didn't think much of it. He'd called a week earlier, said he'd be passing through on leave and could stop by for dinner. I'd even taken the day off from the hardware store to make sure I had time to cook his favorite, roast chicken with rosemary and garlic, mashed potatoes, and the peach cobbler his mother used to make. The phone rang that afternoon just as I was basting the chicken. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice quick and flat. "Something came up. I can't make it." I asked if everything was all right. He said it was. Then he said he had to go. The line went dead before I could say goodbye. It happened again a few months later. We'd planned to meet for lunch halfway between his base and my town. I was already on the road when he texted, "Sorry, Dad. Last-minute thing at work. Can't get away." I turned the truck around and drove home in silence. The roast beef sandwich I'd packed for the trip sat in the passenger seat, untouched. By the time I got home, it was soggy and I threw it in the trash. I told myself he was busy, that the demands on him were greater than I understood, and maybe that was true. but the cancellations began to stack up like bricks in a wall I hadn't noticed being built. When he did visit, the conversations felt shorter. He'd check his phone more often, sometimes answering messages while I was in mid-sentence. I tried not to take it personally, but there's a kind of quiet that seeps into a room when two people who used to speak freely start running out of things to say. One Saturday in spring, the local VFW was hosting a luncheon for veterans and their families. I thought it would be nice for him to come, shake hands, share stories, maybe meet some of the men I'd served with. When I invited him, he hesitated. "I don't know, Dad," he said. "Those events, they're kind of old school." Old school. I repeated. "Yeah, different vibe. I'm used to a more structured environment." The words landed heavier than they should have. Old school. That was his way of saying it didn't fit into the world he lived in now. Maybe I didn't either. The change was subtle at first. He started dressing sharper, even off-duty, pressed shirts, polished shoes, watch bands that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. I was proud he carried himself well, but it made me more aware of my own worn jeans, my flannel shirts, the scuffed boots I'd been wearing for years. Once, when we met at a cafe near his base, he glanced at my jacket and said, "You still wearing that old thing?" He tried to make it sound like a joke, but there was something behind it, something that stung. I laughed it off, but the words stayed with me. The distance wasn't just in the way we talked, it was in the way he saw me, or maybe in the way he didn't. One autumn afternoon, I drove out to the base on a whim. I'd been in the area for a supply run, and I thought maybe I could catch him for a quick coffee. At the gate, I gave the guard his name. The guard made a call, then told me my son was occupied and couldn't meet. I sat in the truck for a while before turning the key. I'd come all that way, and still, the space between us felt longer than the road I'd driven. When I got home that night, I took out the shoebox of letters. I read through them slowly, noticing how the early ones were full of little details about his life, while the later ones had shrunk to bullet points. Less about feelings, more about accomplishments. I wondered if this was just the natural order of things, sons growing into their own lives, fathers becoming a smaller part of the picture. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The clearest sign came during a dinner at his place. He'd invited me to meet some of his colleagues, other officers, and their families. I put on my cleanest shirt, polished my boots, even ironed my pants, which I hadn't done since his mother passed. When I arrived, the conversation was already flowing, talk of deployments, commendations, strategic programs I didn't fully understand. When someone asked about my service, I gave a brief answer, mentioning the years I served and the places I'd been. One of the officers asked a follow-up question, but before I could answer, my son cut in with a quick change of subject. It was subtle, but it was there. He didn't want me talking too much about my time in the military. Later, as I was leaving, I caught a fragment of a conversation behind me. "He's different from what I expected," someone said. My son replied quietly, "Yeah, he's simple, not really the academic type." The words found their mark. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself I'd misheard. But I hadn't. And once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it. I thought back to that little boy at the parade, gripping my hand, telling me he wanted to be like me. Somewhere along the way, that boy had grown into a man who didn't want to be seen standing too close to me. If you've ever felt someone you love slowly stepping away, not in anger but in quiet, deliberate increments, you know it's harder to bear than a clean break. Because you can't point to one moment and say, "This is when it happened." It's a slow fade, and by the time you notice, they're already far enough that you have to raise your voice just to be heard. And sometimes they don't turn back when you call. News didn't come from him. It came from a neighbor, of all people, Mrs. Jennings, the retired schoolteacher who lived 2 houses down. I was out front trimming the hedges when she walked over, her little terrier trotting behind her. "Have you heard?" she asked, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Heard what?" I said, setting the shears down. "About your son. I saw it in the paper. He's being promoted. Some big ceremony next month. Brigadier General, I think they called it." I froze, the sun warm on my neck, the scent of cut branches in the air. The words seemed to hover between us. Brigadier General, that was no small thing, it was a lifetime's worth of service, a rank most never reached. I didn't know, I managed. Oh, I'm sure you'll be there, she said, smiling. What a proud moment that'll be. I smiled back, but it felt tight, stretched. Yeah, I said softly, proud moment. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread out in front of me. There it was, in black and white, his name, his new rank, and a brief mention of the ceremony to be held at the base. No date, no time, just an announcement. I read it 3 times, my chest swelling with pride. My boy, my son, had made it further than I ever had. I imagined the room filled with uniforms, the sound of applause, the moment he'd step forward to receive his insignia. I could see myself there, standing a little straighter, maybe shaking a few hands, maybe hearing someone say, "That's his father." For days I waited for the phone call. Every time the phone rang, I expected to hear his voice, "Dad, I want you there." But the call didn't come. A week passed, then 2. Finally, I decided maybe he was waiting until details were finalized. Or maybe he wanted to tell me in person, so I called him. "Hey, Dad," he answered. "Read the news," I said, trying to keep the smile in my voice. "Congratulations, son, that's a hell of an achievement." "Thanks," he said. There was a pause, just long enough to feel heavy. "Yeah, it's been a lot of work." "I bet it has. So when's the big day?" Another pause. "It's mid-November, still sorting out the guest list." "Oh," I said. "Well, just let me know what I need to do, I'll be there." He hesitated. I could hear it in the small hitch of his breath. "Yeah, I'll keep you posted." After we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my hand, staring at the quiet kitchen. Something about the way he'd said it didn't feel right, but I pushed the thought aside. Surely he'd want me there, surely. I started preparing in small ways. I had my old suit cleaned. Bought a new tie, navy blue, his favorite color when he was a boy. I even considered wearing my old uniform jacket but decided against it. This was his day, not mine. As the weeks ticked by, I imagined what it would be like. I'd arrive early, maybe sit in the second row. I'd watch as he stood on stage, the brass on his shoulders catching the light. Our eyes would meet for just a moment, and maybe he'd give the smallest nod, the kind that says, "I see you. You matter." But the call still didn't come. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before the date I'd guessed from the article, I ran into an old army buddy at the grocery store. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we got to talking. When I mentioned my son's promotion, his face lit up. "That's fantastic," he said. "You must be proud. Got your invitation yet?" I shook my head. "Not yet, I'm sure it's coming." He gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "Well, maybe it's just a small thing. You know how these events can be." That night, I sat in the living room, the TV flickering in the corner, untouched. I kept thinking about that look, like he knew something I didn't. My stomach tightened. I thought about calling my son again, asking directly, but something in me resisted. Maybe I didn't want the answer. Instead, I found myself in the hallway in front of the closet where my old uniform hung. I ran my hand over the sleeve, felt the worn fabric under my fingers. It had been years since I'd worn it, but in that moment, I wanted to feel its weight again. The days kept moving forward. Every morning I checked the mail, half expecting an envelope with the base insignia. Every evening I told myself it would come tomorrow. By the time the week of the ceremony arrived, I still hadn't heard from him. If you've ever waited for an invitation that never comes, you know the strange mixture of hope and dread it brings. Every hour that passes feels like a coin flipping in the air, maybe yes, maybe no. But deep down, you start to realize the coin has already landed, and you're just afraid to look. 2 days before the ceremony, I was in the hardware store picking up some nails and sandpaper when I heard my name. "Hey, Frank." I turned to see Dale Parker, tall, wiry, still wearing the same grin I remembered from 20 years ago when we'd served in the same unit. He'd left the Army before I did, moved into contracting work, and we'd only crossed paths a handful of times since. "Dale," I said, shaking his hand. "Been a while." "Yeah, heard the big news about your boy," he said. "Brigadier General, huh? That's something." "Sure is," I said, smiling. "Guess I'll see you at the ceremony." I hesitated. "Well, I haven't exactly gotten the details yet." He frowned. Really? Huh, that's odd. My nephew's on base. He says it's going to be a big deal. Guests from all over. Yeah, I figured, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Maybe it's just a mix-up. Dale shifted his weight, looked like he was about to say something else, then stopped. What? I asked. Frank, I don't want to stick my nose in where it doesn't belong, he said slowly, but my nephew mentioned something. Said your son told the planning folks he was keeping the guest list tight, that maybe he didn't want to bring family who weren't, he trailed off. I felt my chest tighten. Who weren't what? He exhaled, looking uncomfortable. He said this is just what I heard, that your boy didn't think it would look right. Said you were a good man, but you know you're simple, don't have the degrees, the polish. I stood there in the aisle, the smell of wood and oil heavy in the air, the words hanging between us like something toxic. Did he actually say that? I asked. Dale raised his hands. Look, I don't know the exact wording, and I don't want to stir up trouble, just thought you should know. I nodded, thanked him, and left the store without buying a thing. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound. My mind kept replaying it. Simple, no degrees, doesn't look right. It's strange how a few words can weigh more than years of silence. At home, I sat in my armchair and stared at the wall. I tried to remember the last time my son had asked me about my life, about what I'd been through, about the things I'd carried. I couldn't. In his eyes, maybe I was just the man in the worn jacket, the one who fixed fences and drove an old truck, not the soldier who'd once stood in the desert heat, not the man who'd made choices that still kept him awake some nights. Just simple. That night, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't cook dinner. I just sat there in the dim light, my old uniform hanging in the closet across the room. The medals on it had collected dust over the years, but I could still remember how each one had felt in my hand. I could remember the weight of them, not the medal, but the moments they stood for. And I thought, maybe that's the problem. The weight of my medals isn't the kind that shows in a photo or a resume. I thought back to when he was a boy, when he'd first seen that uniform. He'd looked at it like it was something sacred. Now I wondered if he'd see it at all, or just see the man wearing it as a relic from a world he'd outgrown. The next day the phone rang. It was him. Hey, Dad, he said. His voice was brisk, like he was in a hurry. Hey, son. Listen, I just wanted to let you know the ceremony's tomorrow. I waited, and it's going to be a small group, mostly folks from the base, a few dignitaries. It's just a different kind of event, you understand, right? I swallowed. Yeah, I understand. He didn't notice the pause, or maybe he did and just didn't care to fill it. I'll send you some pictures, he said. Gotta run, talk soon. When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, the quiet pressing in from all sides. He hadn't invited me, not because there wasn't room, not because of security, but because he didn't want me there, because I didn't fit the picture. That night, I opened the closet and took out the old uniform. The fabric was rough under my hands, the seams still strong. I brushed the dust off the medals, polished them until they caught the light again. I laid the jacket across my lap, my fingers tracing the name patch. Our name, the same name on his uniform now. I thought about all the years between us, the parades, the letters, the missed dinners, the growing distance. I thought about the boy who once told me he wanted to be like me, and the man who now couldn't bear to have me in the room. And in that moment, I decided exactly what I was going to do. If you've ever been told you're not enough, not smart enough, not polished enough, not the right look, you know the fire it can light inside you. Sometimes it burns hot and fast. Sometimes it burns slow, steady, until the day you let it show. That night sleep didn't come. I lay in bed with my hands folded over my chest, staring into the dark, listening to the tick of the clock on the dresser. Each second felt heavier than the one before, as if the room itself was pressing down on me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rattling the loose gutter on the porch. It was a familiar sound, steady, persistent, yet it only made the quiet inside feel louder. I got up, pulled on my old flannel shirt, and padded into the kitchen. The coffee pot clicked on, the smell filling the room in slow waves. I didn't need caffeine. I needed something to do with my hands. On the kitchen table sat the jacket, my jacket. I'd left it there after polishing the metals earlier, unable to put it back in the closet. It seemed wrong to hide it away again, like locking up a part of myself that had already been pushed to the edge of disappearing. I ran my fingers along the stitching of the name patch. I could still remember the day it was sewn on, hot, dry afternoon somewhere overseas. The air had smelled like dust and sweat, and the tailor's hands were quick and sure. There, he'd said, now you're official. Official. I'd been wearing the uniform for weeks before that, training, moving, working. But there was something about seeing my name on it that made it real. It wasn't just clothing anymore, it was me. I poured a cup of coffee and carried it into the living room. Steam curled in the dim light as I sank into my armchair. From the window, I could see the faint glow of the street lamp, casting long shadows on the pavement. My mind drifted back to the desert, the days when heat shimmered above the horizon and the air was so dry it felt like it could crack your skin. The sound of boots on sand, the weight of the rifle in my hands, the taste of water gone warm in the canteen, and the faces, always the faces. Some I could still name, some I couldn't. There was one night in particular I could never shake. We'd been out on patrol, the sky black and endless above us. The only light came from the moon, casting everything in silver and shadow. We were tired, hungry, and down to the last of our rations. Then came the noise, small at first, then unmistakable. We moved fast, but not fast enough. Two didn't come back. I carried one of them myself, my legs burning, my breath ragged. I knew he was gone, but putting him down in the sand felt like leaving him behind twice. That was the kind of night you didn't write home about. The kind of night that stayed under your skin for decades. And here I was, decades later, thinking about a different kind of loss. A son who was still alive but felt just as far away. I thought about calling him again. Just to say something, anything. But what would I say? I heard why you didn't invite me. No, that would only drive him further. And I wasn't ready to hear his answer, not from his mouth. Instead, I sat there, letting the coffee grow cold in my hands and tried to remember the last time we'd really talked. Not about work, not about promotions, not about what came next, but about who we were and how we got here. Sometime after midnight, I found myself back at the closet. I pulled out the old footlocker from the bottom shelf. Inside were pieces of a life I'd lived and left behind, photographs, maps, a small leather-bound notebook filled with coordinates and scribbled notes. I flipped through them slowly, the paper rough against my fingers. In the back of the notebook, folded and worn, was a letter. Not from my son, not from my wife, from my father. I'd gotten it during my first deployment. His handwriting was crooked, the ink faded in places. Son, I don't have advice for you out there. Just know that no matter where you are, I'm proud of you. Even if the world doesn't see it, I do. I sat there, reading it over and over until the words blurred. My father hadn't lived to see me make rank. He hadn't seen the commendations, the medals. But he'd never made me feel like I had to earn his pride. And maybe that's what hurt most, realizing I hadn't given my own son the same in return. I'd wanted him to make his own way, to succeed on his own terms, but somewhere along the way I'd let the distance grow without pulling him back. By 3 in the morning I was still awake. The house felt smaller somehow, the walls closer. I walked into the kitchen and stood over the jacket again. The thought came to me slowly at first, then with more certainty. If he couldn't see where he came from, maybe I needed to remind him. Not with words. Words were too easy to ignore, but with something he couldn't mistake. When dawn began to soften the edges of the night, I was still in that chair, the jacket across my knees. The first birds started calling from the trees outside, and I knew as sure as I'd ever known anything that I had a decision to make. If you've ever spent a night turning over the same thought again and again, you know how morning doesn't bring rest. It brings clarity. The kind you can't unsee. Morning light spilled across the kitchen table, soft and pale, catching on the dust that floated in the air. I'd been awake all night, but the sunrise brought with it a strange steadiness. No more pacing, no more wondering what to say. The decision had settled inside me like a stone at the bottom of a river. I looked at the uniform again. The fabric was worn but not frayed. The color had faded a little, the way everything does after years away from the sun. The medals, now polished, caught the light just enough to remind me they were there, not flashy, not new, but earned. It wasn't just clothing. It was years of my life stitched into every seam. And it was the clearest way I knew to tell him what I couldn't seem to say out loud. I went to the hall closet and pulled down an old cedar box from the top shelf. It had been sitting there for years, holding everything I couldn't bring myself to throw away: programs from parades, snapshots of my unit, a rusted compass that had seen more miles than my truck. I emptied it carefully, setting the contents aside, and lined it with a piece of clean cloth. Then I picked up the jacket. I brushed it down with slow, deliberate strokes, working the dust from the shoulders, pressing the seams with my hands until they lay flat. One by one, I checked the medals: campaign, service, commendation, each a marker of a chapter in my life, each one earned in ways I never planned to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. I laid the jacket in the box and for a moment just looked at it. It felt smaller than I remembered, like it had shrunk over the years, though I knew it was me who had changed shape. Next came the letter. I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper in front of me, pen poised but unmoving. How do you fit decades into a few paragraphs? How do you explain pride and disappointment and love all at once? I started and stopped a dozen times, crossed out whole sentences, but slowly the words began to settle. Son, by the time you open this, you'll have stood in front of a room full of people and accepted a rank very few ever reach. You'll have earned it with long days, hard nights, and choices that only you can understand. And I'll be proud of you no matter what. I'm not coming to the ceremony, not because I don't want to be there, but because I think this says more than my presence could. This uniform is part of where you come from. It's not shiny or new, but every thread in it has a story. Some of them are good, some of them aren't, but all of them taught me the same thing: strength doesn't come from the medals on your chest. It comes from what you carry inside when no one's watching. I hope when you wear your own, you remember that. Love, Dad. I read it twice, then folded the paper neatly and slid it into an envelope. I tucked it into the inside pocket of the jacket. I closed the box, fastening the brass latch, and sat there with my hands on the lid for a long time. My fingers traced the grain of the wood, feeling each small ridge and knot. I imagined him lifting the latch, opening the lid, seeing the fabric folded inside. I wondered if he'd recognize it right away, if the sight of it would take him back to the boy at the parade, his hand in mine. By mid-morning, I was at the post office. The clerk, a young man who looked barely out of high school, lifted the box onto the scale. "Pretty heavy," he said. "It's got some years in it," I replied. He asked where it was going, and I gave him the base address. As I handed over the shipping fee, I felt a mix of relief and something else, something that felt almost like grief. Not for the uniform, but for the fact that I couldn't give it to him in person. On the way home, I drove past the park where I used to take him when he was little. The old swing set was still there, though the paint was peeling and one of the seats hung lower than the others. I parked for a minute, watching a young father push his daughter on the swing. She laughed, head tilted back, hair flying. And I thought about how quickly it goes, from the days when they reach for your hand without thinking, to the days when they stop reaching at all. Back at home, the house felt quieter than usual. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee cooling in front of me, and thought about the ceremony tomorrow. Somewhere in that crowd, he'd stand tall, eyes forward, receiving the insignia that marked all he'd achieved. I wouldn't see it. I wouldn't hear the applause, but maybe, just maybe, he'd open that box tonight, and for a moment he'd remember. Not just the soldier I was, but the father who'd been there from the first step. If you've ever given someone a piece of yourself, knowing you might never see how they receive it, you understand the quiet that follows. It's not peace exactly, but it's close enough to keep you steady. I don't know if he opened it right away or let it sit for a while. Maybe he left the box in a corner of his office, too busy with the ceremony to bother. Or maybe he saw my handwriting on the envelope and knew it wasn't the kind of thing you could rush through. But in my mind, I picture him opening it that night, the base quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I see him sliding the letter from the inside pocket of the jacket, the paper soft and warm from where it had been resting. And I see him reading these words. Son, by the time you read this, you'll have stood in a room filled with people wearing medals and ribbons, their hands ready to clap, their voices ready to cheer your name. You'll have stepped forward, saluted, and felt the weight of your new rank settle on your shoulders. And I want you to know, truly know, that I am proud of you. I've been proud of you since the day you first took a step toward the man you wanted to become. Not the day you put on the uniform, not the day you made rank. The day you decided who you wanted to be and started walking toward it. But I'm not at your ceremony. Not because I didn't want to be there, but because I think this will speak louder than my presence. This uniform, it's not just fabric and thread. It's years of my life. It's the desert heat and the freezing rain. It's the sound of boots in unison, the weight of silence after a firefight, the faces of friends I can't see anymore except when I close my eyes. It's pride, yes, but it's also sacrifice. And sometimes it's regret. Every stitch has a story, some I'm glad to remember, some I wish I could forget. And I carried all of it so you wouldn't have to, at least not the same way I did. I paused while writing, the pen hovering above the page. There was so much more I wanted to tell him. About the nights I'd thought I wouldn't make it home. About the moments when a simple act of kindness kept me going. But I knew some truths are better discovered, not handed over. Son, when I look at you, I see a man who has walked his own road, earned his own stripes. You've built something I never had, a career that demanded the best of you, and you gave it. You've led men and women who look to you for strength, and I hope you remember this. Strength isn't in the brass on your shoulders or the salutes you receive. It's in what you do when no one's watching. It's in the choices you make when they cost you something. One day, someone will look at you the way you once looked at me. They'll want to follow you. They'll believe in you without question. And in that moment, you'll realize that leadership isn't about being celebrated. It's about being remembered for the right reasons. As I wrote those lines, I could still see him as a boy, standing at that parade, his small hand gripping mine. I wondered if he remembered it too, or if it had become just another childhood blur. I know I wasn't invited to stand in that room with you today. I know there's a part of you that thinks I wouldn't fit the picture. And maybe you're right. I don't wear suits that cost a month's pay. I don't have the kind of degrees that look good in a program brochure. But I gave you something I hope is worth more than that. I gave you a name, a history, and the understanding that nothing worth having comes easy. If I've failed in some ways, and I know I have, it was never because I didn't care. It was because I believed you were strong enough to find your own way. I stopped again, my hand trembling slightly. The truth was, admitting that hurt, more than I expected. This jacket is yours now, not to wear but to keep. To remind you that before you ever earned your own medals, before you learned to salute, you were a boy who saw one and wanted to follow in his footsteps. And I was the man in those boots, looking down at you and seeing the best parts of myself staring back. Whatever roads you walk from here, whatever rooms you stand in, I hope you never forget that the strongest thing you can be is not untouchable but human. And son, no matter the distance, no matter the years, if you ever need to remember who you are, you know where to find me. Love, Dad. When I folded the letter, I slid it back into the pocket of the jacket with care, as if the fabric itself might remember the words. Closing the box felt final, like sealing away a piece of myself. But it also felt right. Some messages aren't meant to be delivered face to face. They're meant to be found quietly when the noise fades. If you've ever written a letter you weren't sure the other person was ready to read, you know the strange combination of hope and fear it leaves behind. Hope that they'll understand. Fear that they won't. And in the space between those two, you find the truth of how much you still care. The morning of the ceremony came quiet and cold. The frost on the front lawn glittered in the early light, each blade of grass tipped in silver. I stood at the kitchen window with my first cup of coffee, watching my breath cloud against the glass. Somewhere, maybe 50 miles away, my son was buttoning his uniform, checking his medals in the mirror, rehearsing the lines he'd say to the crowd. And I wasn't there. The box had been delivered 2 days ago. I tracked the package obsessively online, refreshing the page like a man waiting for news from a far-off battle. The confirmation had popped up mid-afternoon, delivered. I'd stared at the word until it blurred. Had he opened it right away, set it aside, left it sealed, avoiding whatever might be inside? I didn't know, and today I wouldn't find out. I tried not to picture it, but my mind filled in the gaps anyway. The base's main hall, polished floors gleaming under bright lights. Rows of chairs filled with uniforms and civilian suits, the air warm with the hum of conversation. Somewhere near the front, a lectern with the unit insignia, a microphone waiting. I imagined him standing backstage, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back. The murmur of the crowd would fade for him, replaced by the steady drum of his own heartbeat. He'd step out, the room rising in applause, and for a moment, he'd be every bit the officer he'd worked to become. In my version, he sees me in the second row, gives the smallest nod, but in reality, there's just an empty chair where I might have been. I sat down at the kitchen table, my own uniform folded neatly in front of me. Not the one I'd sent him, but the second set I'd kept, faded, softer, without the full weight of my medals. I traced the edges of the patches, feeling the years settle over me like an old blanket. It's a strange thing, pride without presence. You can feel it in your chest, swelling and burning, but it has nowhere to go. No handshake, no pat on the back, just you and the knowledge of what they've done. Around mid-morning, the phone buzzed. A text, not from him, just an automated reminder from the pharmacy. I put the phone down and laughed under my breath. Somehow, the smallness of my own day felt sharper against the scale of his. I thought about turning on the TV, maybe distracting myself with the news, but nothing seemed worth watching. Instead, I found myself in the garage, pulling down an old box of photo albums. Inside were pictures of him growing up, birthday parties, baseball games, high school graduation. In one photo, he's maybe 10 years old, wearing a plastic army helmet too big for his head, grinning at the camera. I'd forgotten that smile. By noon, I couldn't sit still. I drove out to the edge of town, to the bluff that overlooks the river. It's the place I've always gone to think, wide open sky, the water moving slow and sure. I parked and leaned against the hood of the truck, letting the cold air bite at my cheeks. From here, you can see for miles. And I thought absurdly that maybe if I looked hard enough, I'd spot the base in the distance, hear the faint echo of applause. Of course, I didn't. The river kept flowing, the wind kept moving through the bare trees, and the world went on without any sign that my son was being made a general. But in my head, I saw it all. The general pinning the new insignia to his shoulders, the salute, the handshake, the words of congratulations, the photographs, smiles held just long enough for the flash. I wondered if, in that moment, he thought of me, if he felt the weight of the jacket I'd sent, even if it was still in its box, if he remembered the first time he'd seen me in uniform and the promise he'd made to himself as a boy. When I got home, the answering machine's light was blinking. My heart thudded once hard before I pressed play, but it was just a robocall about my car's extended warranty. I sat down in the armchair, the afternoon light stretching long across the floor. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for company but makes you aware of its absence. I knew he'd be celebrating now, posing for photos, maybe giving interviews, shaking hands with people whose names I'd never know. And I knew that tomorrow or the next day there'd be pictures online. I'd see his face, proud and composed, the new rank shining on his shoulders. But I also knew something else. No matter how high he rose, no matter how far the distance between us stretched, he'd still carry pieces of me. In the way he stood, in the way he faced the room, in the quiet moments no one else would see. Sometimes, you have to let someone stand alone, even if it means watching from far away. And sometimes, that's the only way they'll understand what you gave them. 3 days passed before it happened. I'd just come in from raking the last of the leaves off the back lawn when I heard it, 3 firm knocks on the front door. The kind of knock that says I'm here and I don't know what comes next. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened it. There he was, my son, standing on my porch in his civilian clothes, dark slacks, pressed shirt, no jacket despite the cold. His hair was still trimmed to regulation, his posture straight as ever. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes from the photos I'd seen online. These were tired, searching. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Hey, son." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped back and he walked in. He didn't look around the house, didn't comment on anything. Just went straight to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch like he wasn't sure how long he'd be staying. "I got your box," he said finally. I nodded. "I figured." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I didn't open it until after the ceremony. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of what was in it." "Wasn't much to be afraid of," I said. "Just a jacket and some words." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, words that hit harder than I expected." We sat there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. I could hear the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the faint creak of the house settling. "I should have invited you," he said. "That's not what this is about," I replied. "Yes, it is, he stopped, looking down at his hands. "I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping the guest list professional, making sure the people there reflected the image I wanted to present. I told myself you'd understand." I stayed quiet. But when I read your letter, I realized I was lying to myself. It wasn't about the image. It was about me not wanting anyone to see where I came from. He looked up then, his eyes shining but steady. "And that's wrong. You're the reason I wear this uniform in the first place. I've been chasing your shadow my whole life, even if I didn't want to admit it." I swallowed. "You don't have to chase my shadow, son. You've made your own." "Yeah," he said softly. "But I forgot that shadows only exist because there's light in front of them." The room felt smaller then, like the air between us had been pulled tight. I wanted to tell him everything, how I'd sat here on the day of his ceremony, picturing every moment, how I'd tracked the package, wondering when he'd open it, how I'd polished each metal, remembering what it had cost to earn them. Instead, I just said, "What did you think when you saw it?" He smiled faintly. "I thought it looked heavier than it was, like it carried more than the fabric could hold." "That's about right." He leaned back, exhaling. "I've been thinking about that line in your letter about strength being what you do when no one's watching. I realized I've been chasing the wrong kind of strength, the kind that looks good on paper, the kind people applaud for, but I don't know if that's the kind that lasts." "It's not," I said quietly. We talked for a while after that, really talked. About the early days in his service, about the mistakes I'd made as a father, about the pressure he'd felt to outgrow his beginnings. He told me about the ceremony in detail, every handshake, every word of the speech. And I listened, not with the ache of someone who'd been left out, but with the pride of someone who still had a place, even if it wasn't in the front row. At one point, he said, "You know, when I put the jacket back in the box, I thought about keeping it in my office. Somewhere I'd see it every day. You don't have to put it on display." I said, "I know, but I want to, not for anyone else, for me." The sun had started to set by the time he stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Dad, thank you for not showing up anyway, for not making it about you." I smiled. "It was never about me, son. It's about the man you're becoming." He nodded, then pulled me into a hug. It was quick, firm, but different somehow, like it carried something more than habit. When he stepped off the porch and walked toward his car, I stayed at the doorway, watching. The air was cold, but I didn't feel it. I just stood there until his taillights disappeared into the evening. If you've ever had a conversation that stitched something back together, not perfectly, but enough to hold, you know the quiet relief it leaves behind. Not joy, not closure, but the simple knowledge that maybe, just maybe, you're finding your way back. A week after he came by, I found myself in the garage again, sorting through the shelves. The cedar box I'd sent him was gone, of course, but the space it had left on my workbench seemed almost deliberate, like a cleared spot waiting for something new. I didn't fill it. Some spaces aren't meant to be filled. They're meant to remind you of what's already there. Life slid back into its rhythms. Mornings with coffee. Afternoons fixing small things around the house. The occasional phone call from him, now less hurried. now without that faint distance I'd grown used to. One evening he called just to say he'd hung the jacket in his office. "Not where everyone can see it," he said, "but where I can." I could hear the pride in his voice, though it was quieter than the kind that fills a room. It was the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't need an audience. I thought about all the years between us, the parades, the letters, the missed dinners, the slow drift apart, and I thought about how easily that drift could have continued had neither of us reached out. Maybe that's the thing about scars. They don't disappear, but they don't have to keep you from moving forward. They're proof you've been hurt, yes, but also proof you've healed enough to keep going. The first snow came early that year. I woke to find the lawn covered in a thin, clean layer of white, the world muffled and still. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the flakes drift down in slow spirals. For the first time in a long while I felt steady. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't, but because I could see the path ahead even if it was only a few steps at a time. That afternoon I found myself walking to the park where I used to take him as a boy. The swing set was the same, though the paint was more chipped now, the chains more worn. I sat on the bench and closed my eyes, letting the cold air sting my cheeks. In my mind, I saw him at 4 years old again, standing at that parade, eyes locked on the soldiers. And then I saw him now, standing tall in his own uniform, carrying a weight only he could know. I realized both images were true. The boy and the man weren't separate. They were the same thread, just stretched across different years. As the sun dipped low, I headed home. The light spilling through the trees was gold, the kind that makes even the bare branches look alive. I thought about calling him but decided to wait. Some things are better left to happen naturally. When I reached the porch, I noticed the mailbox flag was up. Inside was an envelope, the handwriting unfamiliar. No return address, just my name. I opened it at the kitchen table. "Dad, I've been thinking about your letter, about the weight you talked about. I don't know if I'll ever carry it the same way you did, but I want you to know I'll try to carry it well. I'm proud to be your son. No signature, just that." I sat there for a long while, the paper warm in my hands. Some things don't need more words. If you've been listening to my story, maybe you've carried your own version of this. A distance you didn't want, a pride you couldn't quite express, a scar that still tugs at you when the weather changes. I don't know how your story will end, but I do know this: the people who shaped us, even in their imperfections, leave more in us than we realize. And sometimes the best way to honor that is not with grand speeches, but with the quiet act of remembering. Thank you for spending this time with me, for walking through the years, the silences, and the small bridges we built back. I hope you and your family stay healthy, that you have a place to return to and someone worth returning for. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.